The times that were in it, Ireland in the 1920s. Welcome to the beautiful gallery in Ballinasloe Library. Our series of talks for the decade of commemorations this year is titled The Times That Were in It, and seek to look past the hard politics of the era to reflect more on social, cultural and intellectual life in Ireland in the 1920s. The decade is often viewed as simply the interlude between the world wars, or in Ireland as a period of reaction, economic challenge and social stagnation. Our speakers, Steve Dolan, Mícheál Ó, Dr. Angus Mitchell and Dr. Emer O'Connor, will in the course of their talks cover the period concerned by focusing on sporting Ireland, visual art, local entertainments and intellectual discourse. We hope you enjoy our series of talks, which is part of the 2021 Decade of Commemorations programme.
Our second speaker today is Mícheál Ó, who was born in Galway. Mícheál is a librarian, poet, translator and non-fiction writer in both Irish and English, and he works as a part-time lecturer in the departments of History and Comparative Literature at the University of Limerick. He has written about the experiences of Irish emigrants, and in particular, the Irish experience in Britain. And his most recent book, a highly successful translation of Seosamh Agrina's Mavalachain, was published last year by Lilliput Press. He has a particular interest in minority groups, including Irish travellers, and has written many books in collaboration with travellers, Roma, fairground people, theatre and circus people. His talk today, Travelling Shows in Early 20th Century Ireland, Some Historical and Cultural Perspectives, challenges the received wisdom that Ireland was something of a cultural wasteland during the initial decades of the 20th century and the post-First World War period. In particular, it explores some aspects of the history and culture of circus and travelling shows, which thrived in the interwar period and were boosted by the arrival of many international artists from Britain and other parts of Europe. A mixed group who comprised a range of peripatetic groups, including both Irish and continental, including Romani and Jewish performers. In an era when radio was still a new medium, in many parts of Ireland, more than 70 travelling shows, including circuses, travelling theatres and revues and fit-up groups, traversed the country, many of whom performed all year round, even during Lent when all other social and cultural activities were suspended. The history and legacy of such groups is only just beginning to be explored, and this talk is one small contribution to the same.
Dús bhálam buchasach rí a gháil Lochtan Lauren Sagáileh as Lochtan Jesh seo an canseo dhéanamh mar chuid den ócáid starúil seo. I'd just like to say thanks very much to the library people who made this event possible today. I'm going to talk about the circus in Ireland and its history, particularly in the interwar years when it was a very vibrant culture with a huge number of circuses and travelling shows, many of them international, crisscrossing the country. Part of it, this really is, in a sense, sometimes people dismissively maybe refer to regional history or local history as history from below, but I suppose I don't see it that way. A lot of the history in this in these anecdotes that I'm describing about aspects of circus culture, the build-up, the agents who went around from circus to circus, the Tobermen, a lot of that they're important aspects of Irish history which haven't been recorded really in establishment sources, and so I think it's important to highlight them and to celebrate them actually as well as part of our celebration of previous generations and the different cultures that were in Ireland. It's often assumed that Ireland was a monocultural country in the past, and in actual fact, if circuses and the history of the travelling shows here proves anything, then it's exactly the opposite. As you'll see in a lot of these photographs at the end of the show and a lot of the posters, it was an extremely international medium well before we had Ryanair and all the rest of the interconnections with Europe. So it undercuts that kind of, it undercuts that sort of version of Ireland, I suppose, you know, that we were poor and extremely cut off and etc. So recent wisdom would have it that Ireland was something of a cultural wasteland during the first half of the 20th century, in the 40s and 50s in particular. Ireland was the Shan Van Vogt, discouraging her brightest and best in their thousands to take the emigrant ship. She was a backwater place given to repressive clerics, moralists, and intellectual Philistinism. What passed for culture often was a fight after the fair, a feud over a bare field, or some other long forgotten hurt or slight, or at least that's what we're often told, depending on who the commentator is nowadays. I suppose this talk will be about a different Ireland. It's exploring a kind of an Ireland that cultural aspects of Ireland that have yet to be explored or acknowledged in any kind of depth or richness. There are very few books about the history of circus in Ireland yet, very few books about show people and about their interconnections in terms of music, in terms of entertainment, pantomime, culture, theatre with other countries in that era. And I suppose it's worth pointing out as well, a man he died a couple of years ago, Brian Fallon. He was the art critic for the Irish Times for years. He was at pains to point out in the books which he wrote, which were excellent, that this version of Ireland that during the interwar period, and particularly in the early decades of the 20th century, that we were Philistines and we were censored to death and all the rest of it, that actually this didn't acknowledge a lot of the cultural richness that was there at all. But anyway, this Ireland may have received less recognition or acknowledgement as of yet, but it was still there all the same, bubbling beneath the surface of things. And this was an Ireland which permeated the lives of both young and old. It wasn't specific to one generation, etc. In the Ireland of the late 40s and early 50s and the 30s as well, there were more than 70 travelling fit-up groups alone, traversing the country, and travelling shows, performing, travelling theatre, travelling shows, various kind of exhibitions and reviews. In fact, the playwright Harold Pinter, famous Jewish playwright from London, he actually started off really in the theatre with a travelling fit-up company in Ireland in the early decades. And interestingly enough, these travelling, in terms of Philistinism and censorship and all the rest of it, these travelling shows performed all year round, even during Lent, when a lot of other activities were halted, I suppose, when other social and cultural activities were suspended. Also, it's worth mentioning there were cinemas in many small towns and villages, places where there are often just the bare walls left standing today. There was dancing and music, sometimes at the crossroads. The era of the show bands was just around the corner. There were pilgrimages, patterns, fairs. We're standing here in one of the most historic fairgrounds in Europe, literally down the road. It's particularly appropriate. The GA was as powerful a spectacle as a nexus for the binding of the communities as it has ever been. And then we had the circus. Okay, the circus was nothing new really within the Irish imaginary of, needless to say. Celtic culture that preceded the worst excesses of the colonial project has left us with rich hints and traces. While still in their pomp, the Gaelic chiefs of the past regularly hosted great entertainments such as the circus, encompassing the best jugglers, circus acrobats, animal trainers, clowns, horsemen that the Celtic world comprised. The Irish devotion to the horse has been well documented through history, so too our love for the clown, the trickster, the crazy fool, Sweeney, has fascinated so many different artists, including Seamus Heaney, etc., the figure of Sweeney, the crazy fool or clown. And I suppose the Irish fascination with the circus and its aura continued well into the 20th century, long after the rise of radio, television, expositions and zoos had begun to tarnish, I suppose, or diminish the circus's lustre in other Western countries. One of the greatest novels written in the Irish language, which, it was translated by Valentine Ironmonger, I think. I'm not sure what year, but in the early decades of the 1900s anyway. Dúiríocht, meaning exile, set in the London Irish community in England by Pádraig O'Conora, one of the best writers Ireland ever produced, Galway man as well. It's the story of an Irish migrant, a traveller who spends his life working as a freak in a travelling show and who recounts his most intimate thoughts and dreams. It is the mind of a man who has been rejected by the rest of society, a man whose thoughts and dreams are just a small taste of the tragic loneliness and alienation experienced by many thousands of Irish immigrants who had to go abroad and emigrate over the centuries. It's worth pointing out the other, I suppose, powerful aspect of circus culture as well is it's an international phenomenon. And the depth, diversity and internationalism of many of the circuses that graced Irish shores in the 20th century, the early 20th century, will surely come as a surprise to many readers, I think. The other thing as well is circus performers have always, and show people have always moved freely between one country and the next, and one show and the next. The art of circus has always been a ferment of new ideas and innovations, and that's very important. You know, they were often the first people to bring electricity to a new place. They were innovators in terms of film in France and in England, and the States as well. The archetypal circus, of course, is you know, the circus of the imagination is the big top of the three-ring tent, complete with poles. But the circus has always been much more than that. That's the point about that, I think, is that it's encompassed a lot more. Steam engines, they were the first people, show people often, to bring them to different fairgrounds and exhibit them. They were often the first people to kind of break down taboos in terms of demonstrating things that people hadn't seen before. Before we had zoos in Ireland, it used to be, when I was a child, I'm not that old yet, it used to be a huge thing was, you know, the school tour was to Dublin Zoo, you know, to see exotic animals. Now we can see them on the television, etc. But it's sometimes forgotten that it isn't that long ago since, and who were the people who brought exotic animals to people before the zoo? It was the travelling menageries and travelling shows and circuses. As early as, so it's a very old thing as well, circus, as well as being international. As early as 421 BC, there's a description of a feast in Athens, Greece, where as noted a personage as the philosopher Socrates was amongst the guests. When the philosophical discussion became too heavy, a troupe of artists and entertainers arrived to break the tedium. The records describe a scene which went something like the following. A jester cracked jokes, a girl and a boy played music and performed a mime. A girl juggled with hoops, placed a ring of sharp swords on the ground and threw somersaults amongst them. So there are aspects of the circus, therefore, that are as old as the amphitheatres of Greece and Rome, where those great patches of sand and dust where the gladiators and their animals fought to the death for the entertainment of the public. The circus has always adapted and changed also. In many cases, as I said there earlier, it was the circus people, the show people, the fairground travellers who brought the first news even of developing technologies. Etc. You know, even on the more risque side of things, they were often the first people to, you know, show naked what the naked body looked like. You know what I mean? And you know, the various sideshows that they'd have in circuses of different types. Now, I suppose in the 19th century in particular, there was a kind of a romantic movement around gypsies, around travellers, around the circus, and I suppose attempts to kind of eulogise and romanticise it. But the artists in the circus had much more difficult than most. And I have some anecdotes here that, you know, it was a very tough life. And there's a reason why there's only a few circuses left now, you know, in Ireland. You know, people were generally born into the family tradition, going right back to the medieval era. And I suppose what the audience saw and imagined when they came to the spectacle and the show was very different from what the flesh and blood performers often experienced behind the scenes. Here are the words of an Irish circus strongman, John Moriarty, a Kerry man who spent most of his life in Britain, travelling in various circuses and performing. He says, circus people in the old days got no schooling. Jimmy Lloyd was Welsh and brought his circus to Ireland and toured up to the nearly 1920 when his show went bust. He finished up working on the docks in Waterford with some of his horses. Lloyd's was a great circus, always a first-class programme. Two of his sons, James and Hubert, performed one of the greatest acts that I've ever seen, the great brothers Lloyd on the bouncing cables, so trapeze type artists. Two ropes were placed across the ring and they would walk on these performing somersaults, playing violins and never missing a note. They would then get onto one rope at opposite ends and pass each other in the middle of the ring, playing on the violins all the while. It was a very strenuous act, and when they came out of the ring, their costumes used to be wet with sweat. Their two sons did a similar act with Chadwick Circus in 1913, and one of them caught pneumonia and died and was buried in Loughrea, County Galway, just down the road. One of James Lloyd's sons was shot dead one day as the show was travelling into Edgeworthstown, County Longford. He jumped off the wagon to have a shot at rabbits in a field, and as he did so, the gun went off and shot him. But the show went on as usual that day, and he was buried next morning, and the circus travelled on to the next town. Charlie Chaplin, the great film comedian, travelled with Lloyd's in the 1907 season as a clown. His salary then was 30 shillings per week. And we know that one of the most famous Irish clowns, who was offered massive money, millions by today's standards, to go to the States and take part in shows over there and in some huge circuses there. Johnny Patterson, who was originally from the north of Ireland, and who ran away with the circus. You know, it was actually his story fitted the kind of the stereotype or the legend, you know, that he was a child and he ran away with the circus. He actually was shot dead during a fight down in Tralee, outside Tralee, County Kerry, in a circus where he sang a song that had political undertones, and he thought it was going to be kind of generic enough that different political factions, Parnellites and other groups, wouldn't fight over it. But the people in the audience were some of them didn't like it, and there was a melee. Sorry, he wasn't shot dead. There was a melee, and he died. He got hit and he died afterwards. You know, and he's buried in Tralee, I think. So just to say, I suppose, a lot of the photographs that you'll see shortly, and also the posters, which are, you know, very interesting. They're based on an archive collected by a man named John McCarthy in Limerick around the interwar period, you know, when very few people were actually taking photographs in Ireland, full stop. Never mind a local person in a small village about 6 miles outside Limerick. And some of his people would have traded horses with the circus people. They would have kept their props with them. Some of the older circus people would have lodged with them when they were there. And he could see that this was an incredibly vibrant culture and an international culture. We don't know yet how he got his hands on a camera, but he did somehow, probably from the States maybe. But he was actually writing, just out of as an enthusiast and a hobbyist, he was writing to the World's Fair, which was a leading newspaper at the time for describing all sorts of entertainments and travelling shows. The entertainers themselves in Britain and Ireland and Europe, throughout Europe, used to actually get this newspaper like the way people would get a daily newspaper today. This is every week or couple of weeks, to find new jobs. You know, where was there a gig going with such a circus, Hagenbachs in Germany, or, you know, Jesuridges in Switzerland or Germany or wherever. And as well as that, they used to have correspondents who were fascinated by circus, or who knew the circus people, or who travelled with them sometimes, who would actually write in and give descriptions of the circus that was in their area, right into the World's Fair, right into different newspapers. Now, John McCarthy was one of the few who used to write into the World's Fair, because that was a newspaper based in Britain, so not many people in Ireland would have read it at the time. But he also wrote to a lot of the local papers, actually, around Limerick and around Munster, saying, in the same way that some people might write about GA matches at the time, he used to write in and give a full description of what were the different artists that were in the show, you know, where they were going next, what was enjoyed about it, etc. So this is a letter he wrote, kind of 1935, to the editor of the World's Fair. Sir, in years gone by, the little town of Cappamore, it's about 5 miles outside Limerick, was visited yearly by all the tenting circuses. So this is 1935. Batty Powell and Clark's, Ginnet's, Lloyd's, Transfields, Cooney's, Keeley and Patterson's, Davis's, Hannafords. They went on to America, actually, and had a big circus over there. They emigrated. Buff Bills, Stevenson's, Duffy's, father of the present John Duffy, he says, Scott's, Bakers, Pools, Bosco's, Chadwick's, and Julian's. I can remember when a child of about 4 years seeing Powell and Clark's circus procession parading through the streets of Cappamore, and the march their band played was O'Donnell LeBoo. So I suppose that's a song that would have nationalistic undertones. So they obviously felt safe enough to do that in Cappamore. Every time I hear that tune, I think of Powell and Clark's Circus Band. That must be about 45 years ago. Processions in those days were splendid. People used to come miles to see them. It was a pity to ever do away with them. Okay. I think 2 of the Ginnett family ran circuses in Ireland, Fred and Claude. I remember a circus with a menagerie here. A series, a mini zoo, I suppose. I think it was Fred Ginnet's, Claude Ginnet's circus also visited Cappamore. So, I suppose, just to go back a little bit about the development of circuses in Ireland, as in Britain, really, they were indelibly linked with the various fairs that every small town had. So it's particularly appropriate that we're at the site of one of Europe's oldest horse fairs here today for this event. But the various fairs that every small town in Ireland once held. So based on an organised system of trade or barter, the fairs were the precursor of what we know today, I suppose, as consumer culture, or the shopping centres and shopping malls that are now so prominent the length and breadth of Ireland. Fairs in Irish towns were frequently based around the monasteries and encompassed both trade and the cross-fertilisation and international mixing, really, of people, ideas, whether social or cultural. Fairs, shows and other public spectacles were also more often than not organised in tandem with religious and cultural festivals of one type or another. While fairs may, in their kind of overt form, have been primarily seen as centres of commerce, they soon encompassed elements of spectacle, sport, acrobatics, feats of strength, and entertainment of all types. And of course, we know that from Britain as well. Say, they call St. Stephen's Day Boxing Day because boxing used to be done on the fairground on those days. That was the day when people got off work. And one of the few days in the year where the ordinary worker had a chance to just relax for the day and have a day off, and people would be looking forward to it for months. So nowadays, instead of boxing, maybe they do still have boxing, maybe it's on television that night, but they also have soccer is huge on that day, isn't it? You know, where an awful lot of people go on Boxing Day to different events, I suppose. So these traditions continue. In Ireland, as in Britain, many of the fairs have very ancient lineages. In Britain, the earliest organised fairs were often referred to as prescriptive fairs or charter fairs, having been the subject of royal charter during the medieval period. Not only were they the centre for the trade in animals, they were also the shopping centres of today, etc. The first circuses then, I suppose, would have migrated towards them, those places as locations. And if you go abroad, say, to France or Spain or any of those places, and the various departments that are there, and it's the same in England with the different regions, Lancashire, Yorkshire, etc., what you'll find is that the circus goes back to where the fair was held as well. You know, quite often. There's a circus here in town today, it's right next to the fair green, you know. So, and that's the same since, and interestingly, it'll just show you the Irish influence on circus. The word for circus kind of site or fairground in Parlari, the circus people's language, which I'll mention in a minute, is actually tober, and that's the Irish word boher disguised, you know, meaning road. So it'll show you quite an Irish influence in circus going back centuries, I suppose, and Irish people's involvement generally in the development of entertainment and circus travelling shows. The first circuses, unsurprisingly, were prefaced on their animal acts, in particular the equestrian displays and the animal shows. And that's interesting because, ironically, today that's the biggest bone of contention, I suppose, in the modern era, in terms of, you know, what's allowed and what's prescribed and all the rest of it is, you know, and it's a big thorny issue, I suppose, about animals in the circus, etc. These animal shows date back to the Middle Ages. Some of the oldest prints and manuscripts in existence depict representations of performing bears, cockerels and horses, in addition to acrobatic clowning, the former frequently counting or nodding their heads, or as the animals now are pawing the ground, having been issued an instruction by their trainer, or dancing to the sound of the music. So, Antonio Franconi is probably one of apart from Thomas Cook in Britain, he's regarded as kind of the father figure of circus in Europe. He lived between 1738 to 1836. He was an Italian equestrian, fundamentally, who made his name in France. He began life as a juggler and wandering healer, and having moved to France, he arranged bullfights in both Lyon and Bordeaux. In 1783, he linked up with the English equestrian and circus innovator Philip Astley, who had opened a riding school in Paris. Together they founded an equestrian theatre named the Cirque Olympique, which I think is there to this very day. So, in relation to Ireland, from its earliest beginnings, circus has had equestrianism and equestrian-related acts performed in the ring as its fulcrum. Trick riding, bareback riding, various forms of dressage, and the presentation of horses. Not only is the equestrian theme an extension of the fairground tradition, when you think of the gallopers, you know, they're horses, basically, the swinging carousels, but it's also simply an expression and a reflection of the way of life which most people lived until the early 20th century, whereby the horse was both a central aspect of transportation and work and just surviving, basically. In an era when zoos were non-existent, the earliest displays of animals in the circus were couched in exoticism. Animal menageries or mini-zoos were a very popular form of entertainment, and many circus families were the catalysts for both the development of these menageries and the later evolution of the institution we know today as the zoo. So, while the end of the 19th century, I suppose you had railways and cars had begun to replace horses as the primary mode of transport in countries such as Germany and Britain, a trend which meant a diminution in the role of circus equestrians. The fact that Ireland was quite poor still at the turn of the century and its relative remoteness meant that trick riding, equestrian displays, and indeed the very transport of circuses and their equipment also remained quite reliant on the horse. And you'll see that in the photos as well, you know, right up to the 40s and 50s, people were, even the 60s sometimes, be long trainer wagons and horses moving from place to place, you know. And it was a very hard job, I suppose. And sometimes as well, of course, you had audience participation where people would like to join in and think that they could do the tricks on the horse as well, you know. And that used to cause trouble at times as well. I suppose it was Thomas Cook, just to finish on the history, the international history side of it. It was Cook with the evolution of the circus tent as the preferred circus arena from the 1900s onwards. He travelled on through the United States with various circuses as well. But the travelling circus of the mid-1900s and well into the mid-1900s was international from its very beginnings, with circus pioneers like Giuseppe Chiarini in Italy, Jacques Tournier in France, and Louis Solier in France, transporting the allure and excitement of the circus to the rest of the world. They brought their circuses to places as then remote for Westerners as China, India, Australia, South America, Russia, and South Africa, and they came as far as Ireland as well. So here we have John McCarthy again. After the big top was erected, the parade took place, headed by the bandwagon. Soon it was time for the afternoon performance. The big top was packed as people came from miles around, and the show was enjoyed by young and old alike. That night, their crowds assembled once again on the Tober, and having paid their way, they hurried inside the tent to a magical world of spangles and sawdust. These were the great days of the circus. Batty's, Lloyd's, Ginnet's, Powell, Clark's, Keeley's, Patterson's. He goes on to mention other ones. Grand Star of Aaron Circus, Heckenberg's. This is from the 30s and 40s now. Hodgini's, Baker's, Bronco Bill's. John Duffy and Sons National Circus, Great United Circus, Wild Australia Circus, Linton and Farrell Circus, Boswell's Brothers Circus, Knights, Corvinios, South American Circus, Vanderberg's, Jesserich, James Brothers, Buff Bill's, Barry's, Circus Reco, Fawcett's and James Duffy's. The sawdust ring is dimmed and then the lights go up. They are with us again. Ted Fawcett and Johnny Duffy, Johnny Kays, Buff Bill, the Corvinios, the Chipperfields. A lot of people will remember them from still involved in circus. And all the artists who performed the greatest show on earth. So anyone who might say, you know, look at how many circuses have survived into the present era, you know, anyone who could say that that isn't a rich variety, an international variety of cultural artists and performers and musicians, etc., you know, it's a huge thing, you know. The chariot was drawn. Lord Sanger was his name. He called himself Lord Sanger. He had a circus, Lord Sanger's circus, an Englishman. He travelled in Ireland as well in the early decades of the 20th century. He says, following Britannia was a string of camels, a herd of elephants, 200 or 300 artistes and 10 historical characters, and then the great chariot containing the band. And that's another thing, that's another aspect of circus history that there's virtually no kind of research has been done into yet. Back then you had every kind of small village used to have its own brass band quite often. And when you talk to older Irish people, you know, quite elderly now in England, they'll tell you that they learned maybe the trumpet in the local brass band, etc. I suppose that film, Pete Postlethwaite was in it. I'm trying to think of it now. It was set in Yorkshire. There came out about 15 years ago about the last mines up there, the mining bands. The villages all had bands as well, brass bands. But what's really interesting about that is there was musical interaction and intersections between various European countries and traditions, and Ireland as well, through the music, and Britain, of course. You know, and I suppose when amplification came in and electricity, that kind of did for the brass bands, really, you know, that they were gone then. But there's a whole raft of books that need to be written about how these traditions influenced, jazz in Ireland, how they influenced pop music, how they influenced country western, how they influenced traditional music as well, So there's a very good book by a man named Noel McCarthy, who's related to this John McCarthy, which traces a lot of the Irish traditional music tunes and how they came from other countries originally, and they went back to other countries, and they went with immigrants, and they came back again from America, and tunes just changing names a lot of the time, but the tune would be the same, but maybe by a different name in a different country, And it would be the same when it comes to the brass band tradition as well. So he says, Neptunes and mermaids disported on its side among foamy seas and palm-fringed coral reefs. The gilt of the chariot glittered and dazzled in the sun, and the bandsmen, blowing their brass instruments and beating drums, looking resplendent in uniforms of white and gold. The chariot was drawn by 40 horses, 10 teams, 4 abreast. Between each wagon, grooms led the larger beasts: zebras, camels, llamas, and an ostrich. How many would you see an ostrich nowadays? You'd have to go to the zoo or to Ford Island or whatever, Such were the circus parades, and they went even into the smallest villages, I suppose, in towns, etc. Now, one aspect of the circus which was very interesting as well, and it's an area that another 5 or 10 books could be written about, is the whole business of the people who came ahead of the circus, scoping the area out to see, were the local clergy kind of on board with the travelling shows or circus? Were the local politicians, were they okay about it, etc.? What kind of fare would the people like? Sometimes they'd even suss out in Ireland because politics is so local. Was the local mayor a Fianna Fáil or a Fine Gael or a Parnellite or a O'Connellite or whatever? Each new circus show was planned weeks in advance and even months of its arrival to a new location. Not only did the advance agents have to scout out and pre-book the attended sites and venues, but the winter months preceding the visits were spent planning the new circus production itself. So I suppose you were then reliant on a visual culture really for the ordinary people, that is, of the posters, the posters and the patter and a lot of that tradition goes back to the very medieval era, really, where by word of mouth people were being told about the circus. Literally a town crier going through, ringing a bell, or announcing it. When Ireland's circuses were in their heyday, we were a poor country. Roads and communications were deficient or non-existent in places, and in winter, the thoroughfares were sometimes impassable. In such circumstances, good communication was the key to success for the travelling circus. People needed to be made aware well in advance of the circus's impending arrival. The first port of call for the agents or advance men or the marketing managers were the local newspapers. They placed announcements in the local paper. These billmen were always 2 steps ahead of the circus. Before they had pulled down in one town, these men had already plastered the sides of buildings, poles and shops in the next. And that's still the same way it is today as well. And I suppose there was a whole culture around the posters, you know what I mean, and the artists who actually drew up the posters as well, Not only did they provide essential or important information in a form that was short or eye-catching and easy to read, but the title of the show, the date, the feature attraction, but they also whetted the appetite through the poetry of masquerade and spectacle, the language of embellishment and exaggeration, and awe, I suppose, and wonder. The circus posters do the same thing. There's no effort to deceive the public, but to express the hugeness, the vastness, and the wonder of everything in figures that carry the idea. If we have 50 elephants in our circus, we say we have 100. It pleases rather than offends. On Circus Day, everybody wants to think and talk in big figures, because on Circus Day, we are all boys and girls again, and we want to believe that there are 100 million trillion elephants in the parade, and a billion funny clowns, and whole bushels and bushels of beautiful ladies and white horses. And I suppose just an example of some of this kind of lingo that I picked out was, because in terms of gender, circuses were male and female, were equal, long before they were in other arenas, I suppose. And you think of the aerialists, the acrobats, etc., just as many women, if not more, than there were men. Maybe not necessarily in terms of the clowns always, but in a lot of the other acts they were. And in terms of the animal acts as well, actually, dog trainers, lion trainers as well, even, So this is from a circus bill in Ireland that John McCarthy included. Coringa, the only female yogi in the world. Knives do not cut her. Snakes, crocodiles, the creepiest denizens of the jungle hold no terror for her. Coringa can walk barefoot on a ladder of blades. Lying on her back on a file of razor-edged broken glass, she allows two men to trample on her chest until the glass is ground to fragments, yet her body remains unscathed. Daggers with which she pierces her body fail to draw blood. Magic, wizardry, willpower, self-hypnotism. Is it any of these? Coringa travels in her own coffin, in which she is placed at each performance. Every possible air supply is cut off by burying the coffin in sand. 6 minutes of suspense and thrills, and Coringa emerges smiling again. In medieval times, this brown-skinned, exotic young woman would have been burned at the stake as a witch. So the person is saying, we're actually very modern, we're very sophisticated, as compared with people before, etc. This guy, one of the Daniels family, they would have been antecedents of Paul Daniels, the magician, who was in Britain for quite a few years. He describes one performance they did up north at one stage. The town was covered in posters. Okay. Most towns and villages had someone who was a bit of a character. So often the advance men or the billmen would tap into the local character. The person who, we all know them. Sometimes they would be at GA matches as well. Sometimes sending the crowd the wrong way sometimes, and they'd try and take over and take charge of something that, wasn't really their job in the first place. But and people would tolerate them because they were the character kind of thing. And there's still plenty of these people knocking around, but the local character, one of the characters in Arva, County Cavan, he was the local bill poster and bell ringer. We called him Josser. He found it difficult to pronounce words. Part of his job was to parade the town half an hour before the show and remind the people about opening time, etc. The name of the hall in use at that time was the Moonlight. On the opening night, Bracey Daniels was standing at the door of the hall when he heard Josser coming up the main street, ringing his bell and calling out at the top of his voice, "In the moonlight tonight, Dirty Daniels is showing his pictures." He could not manage the name Bracey. He couldn't pronounce it correctly. A rearrangement of his announcement was quickly organised. I refer to these men as characters with respect. They were hard workers earning a living. So I just want to maybe just, I don't want to go on too long. Okay. Yeah, just as regards audience participation, this is an incident that happened in Ireland, so it's worth I suppose, citing, because it's an interesting one, I suppose. On one occasion during our second season, we got to, I won't say where it is, it's between Limerick and Ennis, and stood in the swamped field over the bridge near when the police barracks was at the time. The circus was packed as usual. Lloyd let them in till the ring was covered with the people right up to the king pole. The people demanded a performance, but Lloyd could not clear the ring, so he uses his blackthorn stick, but all to no purpose. We had Biru, Ham and Bird, a trapeze act with us, so they were put on to start the programme. They worked their act on the king pole, and above them again was the iron ring with 24 or 25 flare lamps burning. So this is just before maybe the advent of electricity. After Bingham and Bird had done about 3 tricks, someone cut the lamp rope. Lamps, artistes and apparatus all came down together. The tent was in darkness and the audience stampeded out and cut their way out, but luckily the lamps did not set fire to the tent. Then the shindig started. Everybody wanted Lloyd's blood and their money back. Hugh and Jay Lloyd and myself had the takings and all the money in Lloyd's wagon. We had it all in a tin box and got away into the city safely. James Lloyd Sr. was taken and locked up in the police barracks for his own safety. He was the ringmaster. When our circus left for Ennis next morning, it looked a sorry and bedraggled rag shop, but Lloyd and his merry Mexicans, as he styled us, were all well armed and ready for any ambush that might be lurking in the offing. So he describes various other circuses then. But I suppose what came after the equestrians, or in terms of what's the word? Importance, were the trapeze artists and the aerialists, and that's still the case today. You know, that the aerialists, you know, they haven't been affected, I suppose, by any kind of big shutdown for various, misdemeanors, etc. I suppose, or you know, apparent misdemeanors, you know, or things that are deemed against the law. I just want to really just to finish up maybe just by describing, you know, I just described a few incidents that were noted by people who were ordinary people who wrote to the World's Fair or who wrote to local newspapers or who gave very detailed descriptions of every single act and every single performance that was in the show, and highlighting the internationalism, I suppose. Like John McCarthy says about one show, Captain Knight's Circus visiting a Capamore on Saturday, August the 16th, 1935. He has a fine selection of beautiful coloured horses in splendid condition. The Irish were always fascinated by horses and always interested in how many horses somebody had, what they looked like, what shape they were in, etc. And it'd be the same at the fair here as well every year. We were delighted to see our old friend Jack Jackson, advance agent, back again. We've missed him for the past few years. He's no stranger to Capamore. He first came here about 26 years ago with Major Fred Lewis. He was a pretend major, he used to call himself Major Fred Lewis. When he was advance manager for the late Buff-Billed Circus and Menagerie, attractive Circuses worked wonders with dogs, and the amount of painstaking training which went into the match with balloons is almost impossible to detail. It was rated one of the most entertaining dog acts in the world. Her successes in England included various seasons with Bertram Mills Circus, appearances at the London Palladium. She was reared in Limerick, so she must have been born and reared in Limerick and lived near the railway station. Her early schooling was at the Presentation Convent School, and she remembered her childhood days there when she used to play the card. I presume that means maybe skipping school, etc. So she was a famous Circus. She was a famous, and all the Kays were famous entertainers. I think Danny Kay was another, connected to those people as well. And Charlie Chaplin, of course, his people were, he grew up in the East End of London, but his people were from Ireland originally, who'd emigrated there. And we have a film festival every year down in Kerry because he used to visit Ireland virtually every year, And but his whole culture really came out of circus and mime, In fact, he did very few films that were talkies, It was the silent films that he was interested in. And I suppose, so basically you have these people kind of recording from below, I suppose, from the ground up, what were the different shows and who were the different people. And John McCarthy used to list every single artiste then that was in every show, French knockabouts, acrobats, the Liberinis, continental bareback riders, Mandina, Grace on the Silver Thread, I presume an aerialist, 8 Liberty ponies presented by Roberto Germain, Haralda and her Wonder Zebra, Bob Worth, juggler, 3 Hesters, they were a trampoline act, Alia and Nico, continental clowns, couriers, they had skill with 7 horses, Simba, a baby elephant. Would you ever see a baby elephant now or any kind of an elephant in a show nowadays? The Paul Selish troupe, motorcycle act from Germany, Lucille, Queen of the Air. That's just one show, So they were very keen to kind of emphasize the internationalism of it, that I suppose they were thinking ahead, and they could see, like, someday people are going to be looking back at what has been saved from this era, what has been recorded, etc. And I suppose the other thing about it is the Irish people who could see that this was a separate culture, a very rich one, a very old one, going back to at least medieval times. They were aware also that, because of the changeover from the Irish language to English in Ireland, that a lot of our history, particularly all the history from the people, from the ordinary people, had basically been either wiped out or had never been interrogated yet, or collected, I mean, a lot of our history, say in the Irish language or in Latin, etc., the manuscripts that survived, thankfully, it was the British who survived them, that they have them in the British Museum or in other libraries around Britain and archives, etc. But otherwise, they would have been destroyed. And a lot, like really, when we're looking at Irish history, until very recently, we're looking at establishment history a lot of the time. It's what the government said or what the state said happened at the time in English. You know what I mean? It's not. We don't really get what the lives of the ordinary people were like, and that's why it's important, I think, to Circus would have cut across all classes. The gentry were interested in it. They used to host circuses sometimes during the war, for instance, when it was difficult for the circus to keep going in case of bombing, in the Second World War, etc. The Guinnesses had circuses up there. They had circuses, 3 circuses up there only the last 2 weeks, actually, up there, But the other thing as well, what they were keen to emphasize was, it was nearly as if they'd had a premonition at the time, those people, that someday they're going to be looking at us as backward and kind of, that we were cut off, We were cut off from the rest of Europe. We were very poor, etc., etc. And by taking these photographs, I think, and recording a lot of this information in family archives, in kind of local newspapers, and passing it on from one generation to the next, that archive in Limerick has been passed on now about 4 generations at this stage, and it's now gone on to the 5th. They were also saying, we were actually very international. Like, we had a culture, we had a lot of different cultures here, and we were international before a lot of other people said we were international. You know what I mean? Okay, maybe a lot of people were emigrating from Ireland, but a lot of people were coming here always as well, And he even mentioned, say, Stekel Continental Circus, Rio Ito and Yamato performance on the Japanese bouncing cables. People from Japan. In 1935 in Ireland, Okay. So just one last thing is, so I'm mentioning kind of history from the people, history from below, in inverted commas, which I would regard a lot of the time as the real history, what really happened on the ground. But how much information do we have about circus people or their culture from official sources, from establishment or from state sources, etc.? The truth is very, very little. We have the 1952 questionnaire on travellers that was issued. That's 1952 now. That was issued around the country to various school teachers and religious of all denominations, etc., and asking them to ask local people in their area about different aspects of Irish culture, to record it before it disappeared, whether it was healing, whether it was immigration, whether it was prayers, whether it was the famine, all sorts of different topics. But they had one topic about travellers, but there's only very few mentions of the circus people in it. And one is, this is from the north. I remember a family by the surname of Hunter. One family used to itinerate around Ballycastle district in North Antrim in the summer. Another family or group used to visit fairs at which the man invited others to bind him. He undertook to untie himself. However this was done, he was usually called Tie the Boy. He also ate glass and fire. So kind of a Harry Houdini type figure. And another person talks about, the Irish loved playing cards at the time, still do. The big revival of playing cards in the evenings now again with COVID. That they used to have the 3-card trick men and all the rest of it. And same, it's ironic that we're in Ballinasloe, and the only place I saw the 3-card trick being done at a fair when I was a kid was in Ballinasloe, I suppose. But what's interesting about it is say their language gives hints to who these people are. Who are the circus people? They're a very international group. They're a very mixed group. And the origins of show people's language are parlare, which must come from parlare in French probably, or Latin. They're subjects of controversy amongst the few linguists who have taken an interest in the language. There's very few people who have actually taken interest in the language. What is generally acknowledged is that the core vocabulary of this language is an amalgam of words from such wide-ranging sources as Italian, Romani, Yiddish, Cockney rhyming slang, non-standard English, the Irish language, and Irish traveller cant or gammon as well. So you have it's like a code language or a secret language. They were very common in the 19th century. Often associated with different traits, so people could talk to each other in front of other people, in front of the customers, and say, do this, do that, etc., etc., without other people knowing. Parlare, just to finish up on this, it seems to have been only one of a number of secret languages that reached their linguistic zenith in the 19th century and were commonly spoken by groups like travellers, gypsies, show people, music hall people, pantomime artists, etc., groups who kind of survived on the margins of mainstream society. This language was once in fairly common use in the theatre and music hall and in related branches of show business such as the ballet and the circus, and it provides a link between a wide range of often peripatetic performers who engaged with a range of societal groups and functions and occasions, I suppose, and performances. It was a kind of a way as well of having a group solidarity and self-identity as well. But a lot of the language would seem to be from, the Romance languages, like the word for shirt, kamika or camisa. Camisa is from French, from Italian camisa, camica. Camisa is in parlare is from Italian camica. French, your gams, your legs. That's probably jambe, from French for leg. Word for ring was groin or Groinia, that's from Faunia, you know. So an amalgam of a lot of different languages. And I suppose, yeah, there are various different kind of theories about this language, how this language developed. I probably won't go into that now, but it shows a strong Italianate influence. Its origins may lie in a lingua franca originally used on the trade routes of the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages. A pidgin that was developed, I suppose, as a medium of communication, if you want to call it a pidgin, or a register, between sailors and traders from widely different language groups, possibly Italian and Occitan, the latter an endangered language spoken today in some rural regions of France, Spain and Italy, and originally, interestingly, associated with the troubadours of the Middle Ages. It is known by the circus people and travellers themselves as parley or fairground cant or buskers' cant, a lingua franca, interestingly, in which many British sailors were quite expert in the past. In the absence of a secure livelihood on their return from sea, many former sailors may have joined the large ranks of travellers on the Irish and British roads of previous centuries. Thus, the former travellers of the sea came into contact with roving groups of entertainers, fairground people, who picked up some of the pidgin terms and incorporated them into their own private canting languages. Yet another explanation for the spread of this Italian language far away from the shores of the Mediterranean is the well-documented arrival in Britain and Ireland and other countries further west, I suppose, of Italian entertainers who came westwards in as early as the 1840s. Those show people who worked as organ grinders and peddlers, and who were intimately involved in the development of spectacles such as the Punch and Judy show, which survives to this day. And I suppose a modern-day playwright who would have encompassed strong aspects of circus culture and mime would obviously be Chaplin, Marcel Marceau, all of them intimately connected to circus. Beckett, obviously, in Ireland would be our main guy. I can't go on, I will go on, etc. The two clowns. He's using the clowns in their philosophical purpose, I suppose, on stage. And another one would actually be in Italy, which is, ironically, that's where they're saying in the medieval era that a lot of these entertainers were moving out of there from as early as the medieval era with the Punch and Judy shows. In Italy, you had until, I don't know, he might have died about 10 years ago now, but Dario Fo, a very important playwright, one of the most important Italian playwrights of the 20th century. So thanks very much. Gur míle maith, agus I hope gur shin spéisiúil ar ein chuma. Thanks a million.